There we go. Well, maybe we will go ahead and get started. So the absence of, unfortunately, one of the presenters does change the order slightly, but we can just go in the order. The order that I have, I'm so like analog. I have the paper program, but I think it's the same as the order that is in the virtual program, which would be Christopher. I have you down as first. And then because Colton isn't here, Janavi, you would be second. And then Sugui, which hopefully I pronounced correctly, you would be third. Is that okay? Cool. I'm also, so welcome everybody. I'm so excited and thanks everybody for your flexibility. I think we have people from many places. This is like an international experience that we're having, and I'm really excited that the virtual element allows so many people to participate. So I'm really looking forward to these papers. So maybe we'll just go ahead and get started. So what I'll do is I'll introduce each person and their short bio before your paper, and then I'll introduce speakers as they come up to speak instead of doing all the introductions at the same time, if that seems all right. If anybody does need screen sharing, now that I'm the host, thanks for the tip there, I can help with that. So maybe we should go ahead and just get started. So if you will allow me to introduce Christopher, wait for it, Christopher Natali. His paper is called Sinners in the Hand of an Angry Mob. He's a PhD student at the University of Nevada, Reno, where he works as a supplemental instructor and teaching aide. His primary research interests include New Historicism, 19th century American literature, American Gothic, and early 20th century American literature. So take it away, Christopher.
Hello, I don't have a great mic, so I'm going to be like leaning into your face here, so I apologize. Should I just start going?
Yeah, get going. I can hear you okay. I hope everyone else can, and we can just get in there. Okay, great. Yeah, please.
Cool. All right, then hopefully I don't cut out. So neither the small village mythos or the city construct appeared overnight in America. Both of these social constructs grew and evolved from the ideologies imported by colonists, which America used to grapple with the explosive technological and scientific growth occurring in the 19th century. Ultimately, there was a palpable negative response to the industrialization amongst Americans, and this response encouraged the ever-growing division between urban and rural, which is concisely defined in Raymond Williams' The Country and the City. Williams' text demonstrates how economics, social change, and industrial growth has impacted rural people while shaping and changing the relationship between them and urban citizens. Williams provides ample evidence that the division between the city and village occurred before the first group of settlers came to the Americas. Pastoralism naturally fits in this division and focuses on the liminal space occupied by the shepherd between society and wilderness. Leo Marx defines pastoralism as seeking to enlarge the conventional view that equated the literary recoil from industrialization with the relatively local viewpoint of the Romantic movement, also recognizing that there was a palpable negative response to industrial revolution. Philosophically, in pastoralism, the shepherd interacts as much, if not more, with nature than with community, fulfilling a role as an intermediary between civilization and the wild. Nature, specifically neo-pastoralist ideals, and worldliness, specifically industry and government, are socially and monetarily divided ideologies. Marx contextualizes how pastoralism combined with American values by substituting the husbandman for the shepherd in Hallett Smith's account of the pastoral ethic. It was easy to transform the farmer into a cult figure. Instead of striving for wealth, status, and power, he may be said to live a good life in a rural retreat. He rests content with a few simple possessions, enjoys freedom from envying others, feels little to no anxiety about his property, and above all, he does what he likes to do. Essentially, the American farmer replaces the Virgilian shepherd while simultaneously embracing Franklinian values and coexisting at a near spiritual level with the land around them. This division between urban and rural communities becomes the basis for claiming a city can be of God or of destruction, clearly linking biblical allusions and the personification of the city as a living entity. Realistically, however, despite the fears surrounding so much social and industrial change, it always has and always will be human nature that determines the qualities of a city and not the reverse. Therefore, to question whether anywhere is a city of God or city of destruction is to gaze into the neo-pastoral abyss of American culture and evaluate the corruptive power of humanity. Two influential colonial leaders disagreed on the morality and ethics of growing and expanding for financial gain. This is John Winthrop and William Bradford. Winthrop, a proponent of growth and advancement, voices the value of worldliness, while Bradford, proponent of community, touts the neo-pastoral importance of country living. Winthrop asserts the necessity of a class system as God's will, since some must be poor, some must be rich, and some must be in charge of the rest. The important caveat is that Winthrop understands that a prescribed hierarchy allows society to function, and it requires compliance. So fast, concrete social positions or ideologies that maintain functionality primarily in the city, most likely due to the variety of socioeconomic stations available versus rurally. Winthrop qualifies economic prosperity as the ability to best provide for your own family, further qualifying a good Christian as an individual that, as necessity dictates, may also provide economically for the good of the community. It is clear that for Winthrop, economic prosperity demonstrates God's good graces, a concept which American industrialists would also adopt, which coincides with the prosperity of the city and its industrious wonders. Bradford ultimately promotes the other side of the argument, affirming country values or the humble communal qualities that Williams attaches to rural life. Community had been a central cause for survival amongst the rural poor. Therefore, unlike Winthrop, who believes prosperity strengthens a community and its ability to provide for itself, Bradford believes it weakens the community as it promotes individual gain over communal gain. Economic and personal prosperity is viewed as a boon or gift of God by urban standards, but the close-knit rural community becomes divided by it economically and physically. Bradford is upset that people use the demands of their economic prosperity to justify a lapse in community and communion. Bradford naturally disapproved of this growth as it pushed the community further apart and justified individual self-reliance over communal effort. This contextualizes why, amidst industrial and technological advancement in the 19th century, America was having an identity crisis. With such rapid advancements nationally, massive wealth was being generated, plus an ever-widening gap between the haves and the have-nots. A strong resurgence of pro-pastoral and anti-city ideologies began to spread between working-class Americans. Americans that sided with sentiments of classism, elitism, and wealth generation were the stereotypical / quintessential proponents of the city, while the working poor considered them to be bad. Negativity towards the business elite transferred to the cities themselves, transforming them into cities of destruction, sin, and depravity, a warning to the youth that considered going there. This allowed small rural communities to capitalize on older traditional American qualities while othering urban America. Considering this, it becomes logical that this discussion or argument over American values would find its way into 19th century American literature. The Man of the Crowd by Edgar Allan Poe then becomes a perfect example of the anxieties many Americans felt in the mid-19th century towards ever-growing industrial power. Poe pairs social anxieties with cultural anxieties to add a liminal space of his own in this work. The Man of the Crowd combines multiple American anxieties into one unified voice, as this short story emphasizes how dirty and unclean large cities are, how individuality is consumed in these labyrinthine urban jungles, and how violent, dense gatherings of population can be. Poe complicates this anxiety because he doesn't fully respond to it. The city is neglected and unclean, individuality is lacking, and violence is presumed. The narrator of the story then represents the anxieties of many Americans, with the writer allowing for skepticism. Poe employs realistic setting and descriptions to bring to life the anxieties around filthiness of a major city, creating a voice that can be heard by any reader. This filth translates not only into the disease and decay of the body, but also of morals and ethics. Poe's narrator is just starting to recover from some unnamed but presumably severe illness that has taken him, quote, some months to overcome. Poe subtly informs his reader beyond the duration of the illness to the point that the narrator was, quote, was now convalescent, indicating that he may have had an illness severe enough to potentially require surgery and, at the very least, confinement to a hospital bed during that time period. The rampant spread of disease is a chief concern as populations grow, as many illnesses can result from overclose proximity, like the outbreak of yellow fever in Philadelphia and New York during the 1790s. Health concerns would most likely be associated, even without a recovering narrator, with large cities like London or Paris. But the purposeful inclusion is an indication of the voice he represents. Massive populations directly translate into the spread of disease, which, even with the ever-growing power of science, was still a frightening, invisible force of nature that people didn't understand. Additionally, while it is presumed the narrator became ill because of the city, it is important to note that the city has the technological and medical means to treat this illness, which demonstrates Poe's complication of the bias against the city. The power of this pollution decay not only afflicts the narrator, but continues to slowly consume Poe's London itself, and by extension, any metropolitan center. As Poe describes a city center that is, quote, worm-eaten, overgrown, and teeming with desolation, the biased belief that extreme miserable poverty only existed in large cities connects directly with the decay of city morals and ethics. The, quote, accidental lighting is an indication that, unlike the nicer portion of the city, the lamps are placed sporadically, making the area poorly lit and less safe. The flop houses are so decayed they appear they will crumble, and one can really only guess how much protection they offer from the elements. In addition, they are so tightly packed together to accommodate the masses that it is difficult to find the streets traversing this urban labyrinth. The horrible filth in the gutters directly represents disease and pollution. Though briefly, Poe voices the other method that decays society from within, as the narrator follows the man of the crowd to a, quote, suburban temple of intemperance. It is fair to assume that bars are commonplace everywhere, and society has been drinking in excess for as long as alcohol has existed. Poe's emphasis on this particular bar is intentional. Hard, cheap liquor only serves the purpose of excessive intoxication, contextualizing the idea that it was a, quote, temple of intemperance, extra emphasis due to intemperance being capitalized. This area of poverty also being riddled with, quote, crooked, devious, and gloomy streets not only defines how these urban wastelands were seen, but how they existed. This slum exists in the heart of the city, threatening to spread its malignant influence to the entire body of London. Social and medical illness threatened every city. The fear of industrialization, commodification, and the power of currency were feared more than the ugliness of some aspects of human nature. Poe's London is ugly in places and filled with socioeconomic disparity, but aside from the narrator's imagined bias, nothing actually occurs in these streets. Equally frightening is the threat that as civilization grows, the individual diminishes. Poe creates this consumption of individuality as his narrator watches the people of London. Initially, there are too many people for the narrator to even identify and could only make, quote, abstract and generalizing descriptions. But over time, as he adjusts, could identify commonalities and proceeds to start describing people by their presumed trades. Just as bad as not being able to even tell people apart in terms of stripping away individualism, the narrator is only able to distinguish people by their general attire, which is equally harmful to one's autonomy. Every human description made by the narrator is broad and general, demonstrating not only his inability to distinctly identify any particular individual, but the impossible task of society making that distinction. Inevitably, outside of an employment-based class system, there is no distinction between citizens. The narrator, and by extension London, failed to provide even the most basic kind of individual quality. Furthermore, these people are accustomed to this level of domestication, as the actions of various groups amongst the crowd are described uniformly and sound robotic. Devoid of emotion, they're focused only on arriving at their intended destination, too busy to even be bothered by disruptions. Others come to the sad realization that despite being surrounded by a throng of people, that they're entirely alone, feel incredibly awkward if anyone acknowledges their existence, using fake smiles to diffuse a situation that never had the energy or potential to be explosive. The city, industry, and pursuit of profit has mechanized this society. An impossible number of faces means that none can stand out, contextualizing possibly the importance of self, so strongly promoted by Franklin and Emerson, which had become a central American ethic. This becomes the grounds of supposing the man in the crowd was capable of being a wondrous criminal, since not only could he weave in and out of this faithless mob of monotony, but he could at any time be in said mob without anyone being the wiser. This helps contextualize the violence, something that seems to logically increase exponentially as populations grow, that people feared. The criminal element large cities pose because it would be impossible to identify a criminal until it's too late. Poe complicates this fear because it is inaccurate at best to assume you can judge an individual's nature at a glance. The narrator's frank, unemphasized comment that all great cities are infested with thieves asserts that not only do great cities, as in large cities, have swindlers, but they're also infested with them, like rats, notorious disease-carrying vermin. Infestation is another passive but clear method of describing the decay of ethics and morals having a central location inside great cities, and there were the crooks that could be found in broad daylight. Referring to where they live as a den also alludes to vermin, disease, and decay within the city itself, corrupted down to the core. Not only potentially criminals, but the quote infamy mentioned by the narrator directly translates to the city's undesirables, such as prostitutes, gamblers, and drunks, which fill the street as the sun sets like cockroaches. Even worse are the poverty-stricken areas where crimes of desperation are commonplace. This language dehumanizes these people based on imagined crimes. The reality then is the only real information is that these people are poor and most likely deserve pity instead of judgment. Desperate crimes are the kinds of crimes that aren't deterred by law or police, adding extra emphasis to their inevitability, giving voice to those that feared growth and economic change. People feared the social and autonomous decay associated with large cities. This is an emphasis on the corrupting and divisive power of commerce Bradford feared and the negative qualities of excessive income Winthrop cautioned against. Small communities believed they were free of the problems larger cities ailed from, comforted by the belief that their familiarity with each one another shield them against concrete and abstract social decay. As such, it really comes as no surprise that whilst Poe's narrator follows an individual that is presumed to be criminal and is assumed to be plotting some vile action, that this fictional construct of London is actually the entity being scrutinized. The narrator accuses individuals of dark nature and sin, while the filth and neglect of the city are openly demonstrated without question. The individuals then might be bad, but the city demonstrates without a doubt that it is. The city of London, in the man of the crowd, embodies and openly presents all the fears and anxieties Americans suffered regarding industrialization, commodification of nature, and the growing value and familiarity with monetary currency, all of which contextualizes the difference between a city of God or a city of destruction. Realistically, though, a city is comprised of its people, and those people determine what is moral, ethical, and right at the end of the day. And to an author like Poe, there were no cities of destruction or God, just polluted, corrupt, and vile humanity.
That was great. Thank you very much. It's all for that. Thank you so much. That was excellent. I'm so excited about how these papers are going to speak to each other. So thank you so much, Christopher. And our next presenter is Janavi Gupta, and she's in her first year of a Master of Philosophy student at the Department of English at the University of Delhi. Currently, she's studying the intersections of humor and science fiction, which is also very Poe. Her other academic interests include, but are not limited to, children's literature, women's writing, graphic narratives, and short fiction. The paper she's presenting to us today is Stanton's revision of the vision of the Declaration of Independence. So take it away.
Thanks. Hi, everybody. I was wondering if before I jump into the paper, anybody could tell me if my voice needs fixing, as in if it's too loud or too low.
Okay. I can hear you just fine.
Okay, great.
Yeah, I think you're good.
Thank you. The Declaration of Independence, a distinguished American political statement in a great prose style, outlines the philosophy of American Constitution and democracy. Its guiding principles have been evoked and extended many times in political history to criticize governments abusing their powers. It has proved to be a flexible model for advocating people's rights that might be self-evident truths, but frequently require repetition and defense. Thoreau, in his Civil Disobedience, echoes this idea that it is the people's right and duty to overthrow governments that jeopardize men's unalienable rights. He does this in order to assert Mexico's right to revolt against American occupation. This paper, however, looks at an even earlier dialogue with the original declaration. Elizabeth Cady Stanton's Declaration of Sentiments, read out in 1848, is one of the earliest examples in this tradition of evoking and responding to the 1776 Declaration. Stanton creates the founding document of American women's suffrage and equal rights efforts through a parodic recreation of America's founding document. Borrowing its rhetoric and structural flow, she not only aims to expose the history of mankind as a history of, quote, repeated injuries and usurpations on the part of man toward woman, unquote, but also implicates the nation's founding document as part of that history. The original Declaration's vision of democracy, independence, and individual rights are revisioned by Stanton to appeal for its broader political application. So here on, Declaration of Sentiments would be referred to as the 1848 Declaration, and the Declaration of Independence would variously be referred to as the 1776 Declaration or the original Declaration and some other epithets. Linda Hutchin, in A Theory of Parody, explains that parody is imitation or repetition with critical distance. It is more than allusions or quotations in that it highlights difference in addition to similarity with the original text. Moreover, parody has been misunderstood to be capable of only mocking. Hutchin notes that it can have a range of intent, including reverence, playfulness, scorn, and more. Stanton's text is carefully and deliberately styled like the 1776 Declaration, but with feminist additions and corrections. She keeps its iconic statements intact to underscore its easy glossing over of women in language and consequently as political subjects of the newly freed nation. Revisions like, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men and women are created equal, expand the original declaration's myopic recognition along the axis of gender. By this linguistic insertion of American women in the nation's founding framework of citizenship and rights, Stanton reappropriates its legacy in service of the suffragist struggle. Declaration of Sentiments, therefore, stands at the head of a long fight to secure women's rights, which continue to date. The 1776 Declaration was used to, quote, publish and declare, end quote, that the 13 American colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states. It employs agential verbs and an assertive tone, emblematic of the complete cutting of the umbilical cord that connected America with Britain. The we of the 1848 Declaration, in the same spirit of self-affirmation, demands an equal station from the American Constitution. They insist on the immediate admission to all the rights and privileges which belong to them as citizens of these United States. Their motive is not to sever ties with the American Constitution or the society. They draw upon the authority of the 1776 Declaration, but to firmly ask to be recognized as equal citizens of the same nation and for the rights already constitutionally guaranteed. Unlike the 1776 document, Stanton's text declares sentiments, which are beliefs or opinions colored by emotions, of the disenfranchised one half of the people of America. The text states that American women feel themselves aggrieved oppressed, and fraudulently deprived of their most sacred rights. On this feeling, the claim to be recognized as citizens of America at par with the American men rests. The negative stereotypical association of feelings and emotions with women is embraced in the title and text to build a case for women's rights. The political thought that women's rights are citizens' rights is inscribed in Stanton's revisions. Through her edits and parodic echoes, she makes textual space for the sentiments about women's subjugation within the rational arguments of the 1776 Declaration. The original document has a litany of complaints, beginning with capital H he. Directed towards King George III of Britain, they work to establish him as a tyrannical and an incompetent ruler. The list offers his political actions and inactions that jeopardize the safety and happiness of the erstwhile 13 American colonies. In a similar fashion, Stanton's text submits facts of tyranny of men over women to a candid world. Her text offers a list of atrocities against women by a capital H he, which here stands for the entire mankind. The breadth of this list covers the multifaceted history of subjection of American women by men. The list goes beyond political injuries of women to include the civil, social, and religious limits imposed on them. All these Stanton claims guarantee women's subordinate position to men. The document's record of atrocities against women in and beyond the political sphere is in line with Stanton's broader politics. Most advocates of rights of women of the time focus solely on the right to vote. Stanton, however, envisioned a broader fight wherein political franchise was just one of the many rights to be won for women. Reminiscent of Benjamin Franklin's Polly Baker, who delivers a speech about the rigidity and unreasonableness of some state laws to her judicial bench, Stanton delivered a speech in 1892 before the Judiciary Committee of the US House of Representatives. Her appeal there too is broader than securing the right to vote for women. She makes a case for the American woman to deserve, I quote, the solitude and personal responsibility of her own individual life, end quote. She elaborates, the strongest reason why we ask for women a voice in the government under which she lives, in the religion she is asked to believe, equality in social life where she's the chief factor, a place in the trades and professions where she may earn her bread, is because of her birthright to self-sovereignty. This view of women as individuals with rights rests on her insistence to see women as human souls and citizens in line with America's Protestant and Republican thought, respectively. In her view, the incidental relations of life, such as mother, wife, sister, daughter, have been used too long to deny women their rights and duties as an individual, as a citizen, and as a woman. Declaration of Sentiments was read out in 1848 at the Seneca Falls Convention in New York, which later came to be known as the First Women's Rights Convention in America. Attended by approximately 300 people, it gathered 100 signatures, mostly by women. The Declaration of Independence, in contrast, was a national affair and was signed by America's then constituent 13 colonies. While the latter document stood as a bold proclamation of America's independence from Britain, the former document initiated a series of similar and larger conventions, protests, and activities to fight for women's rights. This difference between the two documents is further captured in the tone of their concluding paragraphs. The 1776 Declaration concludes with a textual enactment of the natural right to break off from despotic governance. The confidence and finality of its conclusion lies in its synthesis of eclectic systems of the Enlightenment thought and Protestant faith. This synthesis is apparent in the structured flow of the document's rhetoric, its lists, and rational justification and proofs, coexisting with the invocations of divine providence. The signatories of the 1848 Declaration, however, are aware that they are just entering upon the great work before them. The penultimate paragraph sets down their solemn resolve and hope to nationally circulate these ideas and to relentlessly fight to effect their object. The list of signatures in the 1848 Declaration includes the name of Frederick Douglass, former slave and abolitionist orator, and statesman. He was the only African-American person to attend the convention. There, he spoke in favor of the right to vote for women, which aided the passing of the resolution. After the convention, as the editor of the North Star, Douglas wrote a column in support of women's rights and discussed the convention and the passed resolution. Considered its passing an obstacle in the realization of universal suffrage. Declaration of Sentiments, as a parody of the Declaration of Independence, comments on and corrects the indifference meted out to bourgeois second sex. However, with the vantage of our present time, the text's exclusive politics is hard to ignore. Stanton's editions of the plural and singular woman are unqualified and assume universality. Though sympathetic to freed women, Stanton's ideas of women's equality were informed by her own racial and class positions. Stanton, like many other radicals in her time, began her political career as an abolitionist, but she grew to align herself with women's rights issues, to such an extent that post-Civil War, she vehemently attacked the passing of the 15th and the 16th Amendments that gave African-American men the right to vote. Further, the narrow politics of the early suffragists manifests in the 19th Amendment passed in 1920. It failed to include the Native women and the Black women. It would be another 45 years before Black women win the right to vote in America. Despite the class and race-limited politics, Declaration of Sentiments still usefully brings to fore the phallocentricity of our language. Stanton and other suffragists saw that the gender-neutral use of the word man, linguistically and politically, invisibilizes women. The primary aim of her linguistic revisions were to demand equal rights for women in the political, social, and religious spheres. However, the revisions remain valuable early exercise in feminist revision of her language. Later feminists like Dale Spender in her book, Man-Made Language, have more thoroughly inspected our language use and constructions to bring to light the implicit acceptance of male as the norm or the default. Additionally, Stanton is able to meaningfully deflate the sanctity of America's secular scripture in order to revise the scope of its ideals and promises. Lauren Jenney, quoted in Linda Hutchin, observes that, I quote, "The role of self-consciously revolutionary texts is to rework those discourses whose weight has become tyrannical," end quote. In doing so, Declaration of Sentiments has inspired many other attempts to interrogate and expand the we of the Declaration of Independence. Frederick Douglass and Martin Luther King Jr., in their speeches, What to the Slave is the 4th of July, and I Have a Dream, respectively, invoked the ideas of equality by birth and natural rights enshrined in the 1776 Declaration and extended along the axis of race. Such continued appropriations work to bridge the gaps between the theory and practice of the 1776 Declaration. They simultaneously keep the dialogue with the tradition alive, mapping not only where the nation presently is, but also where it is coming from. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was, sorry, I'm holding papers. If I clap, I'll drop them. That was wonderful. Thank you so much. This is great. Okay, well, and there's some claps there. So we have our final paper tonight, and then we'll get to have a great discussion. Let me get my thing together. Sorry, I'm looking at a piece of paper that is, okay. Sulgi Kem is a first-year graduate student in the English department at Texas A&M University. Her interests include the representations of the economy in the late 19th and early 20th century American novels, and her paper today is Alienation and Use Value of the Spiritual in Hawthorne's The Artist of the Beautiful and Young Goodman Brown. So take it away.
Thank you for the introduction. So just gonna read it aloud. In this paper, I read Hawthorne to shed better light on the relationship between a use value and economic production. Although their relationship has always been deemed as complicated, it has also been thought that use value has its own autonomy or finality that makes it independent from economic processes and consequently it distinguishes it from exchange value, whose formation is heavily reliant upon the conditions of the market. Many critics have suggested that Marxian theory has been producing the belief that use value provides a sanctuary from the complications of the market economy. They've been arguing that, unlike exchange value, use value is intrinsic in the materiality of the object and therefore transcends specific historical conditions. Yet I don't believe this is necessarily true. The understanding of use value as autonomous and independent from production is fetishizing or misleading because it tends to overshadow many different experiences of alienation. So I seek to examine Hawthorne's writings to shed better light on, or even to reconceptualize some of the previous understandings of use value. More specifically, Hawthorne's demonstration of art as a form of spiritual labor helps us reconsider what constitutes use value or utility in general. Social disregard for art, for instance, is found in many of Hawthorne's stories. This is reflective of the public endeavor at his time to prohibit individuals from spending their time and energy in creating something that apparently did not contribute to the productive economy. And this is particularly true in the case of the residual Puritanism in New England and of many characters in Hawthorne's stories as they face challenges during their artistic projects precisely due to the particular social perception of art as lacking practicality and usefulness. By unveiling the influence of the social and the political in the determination of artistic value in the stories, I seek to examine the political dimension of the production of use value. For this, I specifically focus on the notion of alienation. Alienation has various implications, but it's been traditionally linked with the notion of exchange value and the market economy. In this paper, however, I like to deviate from this traditional understanding of alienation and focus on the alienation of subjects in the process of production, not of exchange. I examine the cases of particular individuals, such as artists and pious Christians, to understand their frustrations within the process of production. To be more specific, I linked a particular experience of frustration to the rise of modernity, where manual productions, especially artistic productions, began to decrease in value. I seek to examine Hawthorne's critique of modernization, where the modern invention of a new value system begins to undermine the relationship between art and utility, and thereby create individual experiences of alienation. It is interesting how most characters in Hawthorne's stories experience alienation. In The Artist of the Beautiful, Owen Warland, the artist and the protagonist, not only leads a secluded life, but also suffers a vegetable existence where he experiences changes in terms of his physicality as well as of his ability to speak. As he eventually loses his appetite for artistic production, he becomes entirely alienated from himself as an artist and a social agent. Similarly, in Young Goodman Brown, the protagonist seeks for social isolation after experiencing a mental breakdown and begins to question the validity of social values such as religious faith. Alienation in Hawthorne's stories has been widely discussed, but John Dolly's in Hawthorne's morphology of alienation particularly offers critical insights into what it means to be alienated in this specific historical context. Dolly's argues that the prevalence of individualism at the historical moment led to experiences of alienation, as individualistic modes of life often produce egocentric perspectives towards the world. So what he calls the ruinous effects of egocentrism are one of the most prominent characteristics that define Hawthorne's works. So according to the critic, Hawthorne often describes how in a modern and individualistic community, one tends to suffer from the void of his own heart, and therefore must socialize his disease in order to maintain any sense of individuality. Quote, he must show himself to the world. In his nothingness, he henceforth becomes the supreme egotist, for he cannot bear the emptiness of his heart alone, end quote. The critic argues that under the influence of individualism, a person seeks for an opportunity for socialization, but only to attain higher self-esteem. In this case, socialization ceases to produce mutual interactions among one another. Instead, socialization in a modern and individualistic society indicates a particular understanding of the world based upon a strong egocentric proclivity, where individuals see others less as an equal subject than an instrument for them to affirm and assert themselves. Dulles further argues that these instances of alienation are particular to the modern society and other characters and the author himself was situated in. The individualistic tendencies, for instance, were most prevalent within the modern subjects who had no means for appropriate cultural representation and identification. Placed in between the two conflicting value systems, such as art and practicality, religious purity and secular pleasure, or tradition and modern values, they found themselves in perpetual ambiguity in terms of their sociocultural identity, unable to properly associate and assimilate with other subjects. Critics have in fact argued how this ambiguity defined, quote, the difference between the Hawthornian or modern kind of narrative and that of the traditional novel, end quote. So ambiguity reflects the historical experience of the author himself, where he had to witness how certain religious traditions became replaced by newer and more modern ways of living. Hawthorne's stories often reflect his skepticism towards modernization and the implementation of new value systems. In the new Adam and Eve, for instance, the two main characters, who's actually called the new Adam and Eve, literally wake up and find themselves in a very strange place, which turns out to be a wholly modernized community, which is entirely different from the state of nature that they were initially born into. So they say, quote, the squareness and ugliness, the regular or irregular deformity of everything that meets the eye, the marks of wear and tear, an unrenewed decay which distinguish the works of man from the growth of nature, end quote. Modernity has introduced a new way of understanding and determining the utility of things as well. Hawthorne's distaste for modernity, for instance, does not simply stem from its endorsement of artificiality, but also from the idea that artificial products tend to overshadow tradition and its ritualistic values. In the work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction, Walter Benjamin describes how art in modern society becomes completely detached from its original use value as a spiritual and ritualistic symbol and becomes an object of mere aesthetic exhibition. Traditionally, artistic production was considered to have use value in that it provided spiritual consolation for the person who produced the very work. So this is from Benjamin, who says, it is significant that the existence of the work of art with reference to its aura is never entirely separated from its ritual function. In other words, the unique value of the authentic work of art has its basis in ritual, the location of its original use value. The elk portrayed by the man of the Stone Age on the walls of his cave was an instrument of magic. He did expose it to his fellow men, but in the main, it was meant for the spirits, end quote. So artworks used to have an authentic value or an aura because they were particularly related to the specific temporal context in which they were originally produced. So this relation to the specific history and the spiritual utility gave the artwork its uniqueness and its authenticity. But this is no longer the case for most modern artworks that are often mechanically reproduced because they're largely independent and detached from the original work and its use value. So the artists often find themselves alienated because the condition of production, the particular condition of production no longer allows them any kinds of spiritual sort of consolation. Owen in The Artist of the Beautiful is encountering the similar problem. His appreciation of art relies heavily on the traditional terms, which include the recognition of its spiritual value. So he has a strong distaste for anything that involves material coarseness, and it gives him pleasure to see things that are abstractly beautiful. So he says, quote, he was attempting to imitate the beautiful movements of nature as exemplified in the flight of birds or the activity of little animals. It seemed, in fact, a new development of the love of the beautiful, such as might have made him a poet, a painter, or a sculptor, and which was completely refined from all utilitarian coarseness, as it could have been in either of the fine arts, end quote. His aspiration, according to himself, is to, quote, put the very spirit of beauty into form and give it motion, end quote. The conflict between the modern and the tradition is further demonstrated by Owen's inability to eventually pursue art as his profession. His profession as a watch repairer always intervenes when his creative ability as an artist, as it requires an understanding of time that is particularly mechanical and inorganic. So to elaborate on that a little bit, according to historians such as Benedict Anderson, the process of modernization has been significantly accompanied by certain change in the ways in which we perceive time. Time has historically been viewed as, quote, something close to what Benjamin calls a messianic time, a simultaneity of past and future in an instantaneous present, end quote. The future and the past were linked together with the idea that they all exist before the coming of the Christ, the event which makes it unnecessary to distinguish between the past, present, and the future. The development of something like newspapers or the novel as a genre, which are altogether, modern inventions, brought about changes in social apprehension of time, where the medieval conception of simultaneity is replaced by an idea of homogeneous empty time. So this particular change produced a mode of thinking where everyone inhabits and moves calendarically through homogeneous temporal unit, which is often measured mechanically by clocks and calendars. So this is the context where I would situate Owen's experience of alienation. He's constantly struggling because while the artistic value that he seeks to achieve lies along with the traditional appreciation of the ritualistic, the symbolic, and the religious, the life that he leads as a mechanic, a watch repairer, is already heavily influenced by the modern condition that prioritizes practicality and punctuality. To sum up briefly, I hope to have demonstrated the experiences of alienation within the realm of production rather than of exchange, due to the historical change in the ways we perceive and understand utility of things. Hawthorne, through his portrayal of art, was successful in showing how use value has never been autonomous or independent from the external socioeconomic conditions. The characters' experiences of alienation stem precisely from their failure of, or perhaps a resistance to, embodying the different modes of understanding utility in the newly modernized society.
That was great. These were all such wonderful papers. And I'm looking forward to getting to now have a anyway, we got to look up a more informal discussion, because I think there's ways, even though they're about on the surface about really different things. I think I saw a couple of threads that kind of connect them together that might be interesting to draw upon. But I can also Emma, it's nice that you're here. Emma was a participant in the first. There was an earlier session that we did. I think was it just yesterday? No, it was Thursday. Anyway, it's great that you're here. So I can open it, like I've got a couple of things that I observed that link them together, but I can open it up to see first if you guys want to ask each other questions to get started, or if Emma has a question, we can. I'll open it up, and then if it helps for me to have say a couple of things, that I can do that. But I'll open it up to all of you, and your papers were great. I'm excited.
I had a question for, is it Solgif? Is that how you pronounce the name? Yeah, I just want to make sure I got that right. I was interested in what you talked about with this theme of alienation in Hawthorne's works. And I was curious how you might apply that to some of his other short stories, like The Minister's Black Veil or Wakefield. Because there's a couple of other ones where it seems like alienation comes out, or even like My Kinsman, where he doesn't actually get to meet his kinsman, he just kind of rejects him and lets the mob take him away. There's some alienation happening there as well. So I'm just curious about seeing how it applies to more of these Hawthorne stories.
Well, first of all, thank you for your question. Unfortunately, these are the only stories of Hawthorne that I read, so I don't think I have a direct answer to your question, but I do see that I have read a lot of critics who were saying that like alienation was probably one of the most dominant themes that sort of allow us to tie his stories and maybe his novels together. So I do believe that you were, touching upon something that's very important in, analyzing or reading, understanding Hawthorne. So yeah, I think that's a very important thing to think about, and maybe I will read some of his other stories to investigate this topic of alienation further. So thank you.
Yeah, I was thinking about some of his other, thanks Emma for that great question. And I was thinking about some other Hawthorne stories, and maybe thinking about some of those, because there's a great bizarre Hawthorne story that some of you might have read, The Birthmark, where the scientist wants to, his great work of art is he's going to remove this birthmark from his lover's face, but of course that fails miserably, and it's sort of quite horrible, or it succeeds and the success is actually a terrible failure. And so in thinking about that, something that I see that unites all of these stories is that each paper, I mean, not all of the stories, I mean all of your papers, is that starting Janavi with this idea of the Declaration of Independence as being this fundamentally Enlightenment document of rationality, right? And then rationality carries over into the idea of modernization and therefore urbanization. Even though Poe's thing is set in London, right? The city as the sort of modern marvel, and then the clock or the watch repair, right, is the rationality of time in sort of capitalism. But what all of your papers have in common is that fantasy ultimately fails. And so you have to come at it to demonstrate its limits and failures through things that aren't pure rationality. You need parody, which is Janavi's point. You need horror, which is Poe's disgusting city. And then kind of with Hawthorne, kind of fantasy, right? Or dreaminess, right? He has all these characters that are sort of never where they are. I don't know the one with the watchmaker as well, unfortunately, the story, but young Goodman Brown is oh no, I'm in the woods with witches and stuff, or so I'm just really interested in how all of these sort of very American things are actually trying to get at the thing about America that is always too much for the ideal of America. And then you have to deal with it in some way, right? I don't know if that makes sense, but it seemed to be a nice link between your papers. If any of you, have sort of thought about it in those terms, or if you want to say a little bit about that. It's sort of a terrible question that's not a question, but I'm sorry.
Yeah, if I could go
please.
first.
Yeah.
I did. Okay, thank you for that connection, because I didn't think my paper really was that explicit about those the specific binaries that the other two presenters had. Theirs was pretty obvious about this dichotomy and sort of resistance to modernization, and just this fear that fear what this modernization and the urbanization is going to bring to America. And it's particularly these two papers have been particularly enlightening to me, because although I've been a student of literature for 7 years now, but I think because we've been an erstwhile colony of the British Isles, our focus is on the British literature, like around 80% of the course, and we go on to study new literatures, or which interchangeably has also been called as post-colonial literatures. And American literature was something that I was introduced to only in my master's, and it was just like a semester's worth of course. And because it was supposed to be a survey course, so of course some it wasn't like the instructor's fault or something, but nuance does get compromised. And so when we're speaking about America, I'm really sorry about that fluctuation. So when we were speaking about American literature and how the American nation features in it, we had like certain pointers and certain ideas to look for, and progress and prosperity and growth was something, and expansion was something that we kept searching for. Those were the keywords that we had to look for. And both these pages complicated really well. And in the writers that are canonical and also probably taught in academia. So for me in particular. So thank you.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, I kind of want to add on to what you said, Janavi, because I do agree how like the notion of progress is something that is like really valued in like American culture. But what has surprised me while like listening to your presentations and reading some of the, Hawthorne stories was how these literary figures were so against to that notion, and how they sort of like appear more like nostalgic rather than like looking forward to something more modern, or something that's more progressive, right? So like I don't really know what my point is, but I would just want to add to that, like although like these notion of like rationality or modernity or progress, or that those are the things that supposedly represent American culture, there are many literary or cultural figures who were actually quite opposed to those notions. So I thought that was really interesting and surprising.
I haven't thought about that, but Christopher, you had your hand up too. I'd love to hear your response to these comments, which are amazing.
It's interesting because when you discussed this like thread, it immediately made me think of like, I feel like this sense of belonging has always been a core topic of discussion in the United States and in the colonies. And you see that in like the letters from Crevecoeur. You see that in like Franklin's to those that would remove to America. You see that in like Jefferson's like letters in the state of Virginia. You see this sense of who belongs being something that has been central to discussion from day one. And then ironically or maybe painfully then, I mean, because the founding fathers were so, I mean, everything's a binary, you know, we contextualized freedom through slavery, according to Toni Morrison. So, I mean, then in order to contextualize who belongs, we have to define who doesn't. And I think that has been an issue for a long time. But also, I think it kind of contextualizes a lot of like what's going on in terms of American voice and how that's showing up in the different topics that actually we have all discussed today.
Yeah, this is so valuable, and I especially like for all the things that we're talking about, this sort of like view of America from outside of America, because I think it's true that both of you make this amazing point that a lot of the way that America, like one of the central themes in America is like progress, and progress is good. And like, but Hawthorne can be nostalgic about and worried about progress because he already has what he needs. He has the rights of citizenship. He has the right to sort of own the product, you know, to like be paid for his work. He has the privileges of citizenship, so he can wax nostalgic. Whereas Stanton is like, excuse us, like we don't have these things. And so you need to take the ideals that you started with and make them bigger. Progress is actually good for us. Like, let's make this bigger. We can't afford to be like, no, let's go back to some like time where things were even worse for everybody. And unfortunately, though, it was, you pointed it out in such an elegant way that once it starts to look like it's going in her way, she has to then kind of embrace exclusion. Unfortunately, she's not ready for the progress to continue to include everybody, right? And that is the unfortunate way she sort of aligns herself against the expansion of rights for Black men and women and things like that. But at the moment of 1848, she can't afford to like noodle about and like be like dreamy about a magical past when the artist was loved and valued, because she doesn't have the basic things in the present that would allow her to even be an artist if she wanted to. And so that thing about progress is really interesting. It's not, I just think that's a really important and interesting thing to think about. Like the way progress gets cast in American culture is really interesting. And who can say like progress is bad? Like the people who already have what they need usually can say progress is bad, right? So, also, sorry, I will stop talking. I got excited. If anybody wants to sort of build on that or comment on that. Well, I also had another question about, I was thinking about Poe in particular, and his thing about cities is so interesting, because you talked about how the city in the story, Christopher, is kind of like sets up this place where the individual is unrecognizable because there's just so many people, right? And then it absorbs individuality in this really upsetting way. And then it also makes space for like criminals because there's so much anonymity. You can never find the criminals. But I wonder if Poe's especially freaked out about that because he also kind of, I think, accurately was really into the idea of phrenology, that you could actually recognize racial characteristics and therefore characteristics through the shape of somebody's face and skull. And so being able to comfortably identify racial types, and then suddenly you can't because you're in the city. Like, I wonder if that adds to the anxiety for him. Sorry, you're on mute.
Oh, yeah, no, I think that's a really interesting thing to look at, because like when you look at like his Dupont stories, for example, like Murders on the Rue Morgue, I mean, you would think based on that story, absolutely, yes, he would clearly think that. But then when you think about how badly he boffs his second Dupont story with his like attempt to solve a real world crime through this methodology that's completely off base and completely fails. I mean, on one hand, you have an example where I think he would absolutely say the science says that we can look at this way. And then on the other hand, in a similar text, you have the science can't tell you anything based on that. And then also too is like, if you look at like narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym of Nantucket, I mean, how off base are you about Dirk Peters based off of his physical descriptions at the beginning of that text versus the kind of character he is by the end? So I think Poe does a good job of, I think he pokes at everything in his writing. And I think he does a really good job of poking at that science that like Jefferson insisted existed in Letters to the State of Virginia, about being able to determine qualities of someone based on their physical features and their genetics. I think that science, quote unquote, had been widely debunked by Poe's time to the point where it was something to poke at. It was something to discuss, and something to kind of expose for what it really was. So I think that's a really interesting question. And I think this is a non like ethnical way of like kind of poking at that same like pseudoscience.
That's great. That's a great answer. And I'd forgotten about Dirk Peters. I haven't read Pym in a while. And for everyone else, if you haven't read Poe's The Narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym, it's completely insane, and often quite disgusting. But there's a character, Dirk Peters. He's the sort of like, excuse the phrase, the half-breed with the sort of like kind of very strange physique, but he ends up being like the narrator's sort of great helper and champion, right? So yeah, that's really good. And you're right, Poe is always kind of deflating things that he is setting up and then deflating them again, because I think he is suspicious of rationality. And that's why I think that suspicion of rationality seems, again, to be the thread that sort of links a lot of the papers. But I'll go back to my point before, Janavi, like Stanton can't abandon rationality altogether because she needs to be included in the sort of umbrella of what is rational. But I do really like that she also is like sentiment and feeling matter too. So you have to sort of not just rely on these narrow categories. So, and because if you could say a little bit more about that, isn't that part of your argument? Is that part of the way that her declaration was framed was about like sentiment is important too, and our feelings of full citizenship need to be part of the what makes us valued citizens. Is that, did I understand that correctly?
Yeah, so I think this is what parody equips you with. So she is comfortably able to extend or insert her expanded ideas about or expanded demands about rights and independence into this very obviously rational document that almost prides the rationality that it's with which it's arguing for its freedom, for which it's laying down also the foundations of the new nation that it's going to be. But simultaneously, a parody, the form of the parody allows her to make an ironic comment about it, or to invert it by including sentiments, and by embracing and being proud of those sentiments, or actually using that, that's something that's stereotypically assigned to the one half of the human race as something. I think she puts those two very stereotypically associated ideas with the two genders, and brings it to play here in this text, and shows that they can coexist, and the same arguments, the same rights for independence and voting and more can therefore easily be extended to the other half of the American population, as she understood it.
Yeah, that's great. I really like that. And I haven't, I'm looking forward to going back to that text. I haven't looked at it in a long time, but that's really great. Do you guys have questions for each other or further questions for each other? Or Emma, if you wanted to jump in, you don't have to. I'm just.
Yeah, I had a question for Christopher actually. And I missed part of your presentation, I'm sorry to say. So I only caught the last few minutes, but I was really interested in what you were saying at the very end, where you talked about how Poe avoids getting into these kind of moral questions of whether it's a city of God or a city of destruction. And instead he's really he points to the kind of grotesqueries of it and the dirtiness of the city, but not necessarily without making moral judgments. And I was curious if you could talk more about that, because I found that very interesting.
Awesome question. Thank you. Yes, no, I really enjoy talking about this concept of my master's thesis was on about the revolt from the village movement. And I talked about how 19th century literature kind of informs why this movement occurred. And I think a large part of it was at some point in time in the 19th century, maybe end of 18th century, we started to really attach too much nostalgia to a small city. And so the small city became this, this impossible dream, like Longfellow's village blacksmith, where it's this great air, this thing of happiness and godliness and all this other shit. And instead then I think works like young Goodman Brown actually do a really good job of creating the horror that would exist in a community that small. One day everybody so wonderfully, and then the next you go out in the middle of the night and now you think they're all devil worshipers, and you think the old lady's trying to collect souls for Satan, the lady that taught you your little biblical nursery rhymes. So I mean, I think that horror boils down to then this is the individual, you who you feel like you know who you are. I don't want to go down the Lacanian road because that makes my head hurt, but you feel like you know who you are, and you feel like you know who other people are. And the reality is you might know who you are, you really don't know who these other people are. And I think that is kind of the root of horror that Poe likes to poke at. And I read this great article by Henry Weinstock, where he talked about how in The Man of the Crowd, Poe had kind of created this Lacanian other, and that the narrator is chasing his unreal self, or I can't remember which one was real, one wasn't, whatever. But there is that element of horror then that is in the person inherently. It's in who they are. And I think that that discussion where you're talking about the ugliness of human nature versus more obvious physical things like a dirty city starts to become the basis of that revolt from the village argument, where it's realistically everywhere is basically the same because it's populated by basically the same people. So to say that one place is terrible and the other is nice, the only basis you could potentially have for that then would be the density of the population. There's more bad people here than there are there, so this place is worse. And that all boils down then to individuals and not actual cities or villages.
That's really good. That's really interesting.
I just thought the not knowing yourself makes me think of William Wilson as well.
Thank you. That's a great, that exchange was really useful. And I really like that formulation of, young Goodman Brown as being like, isn't the village nice? Oh no, everyone is a witch. And women are terrible, which still links back to Janavi's thing, this anxiety that women have like secrets and we can't trust them to be sort of like us enough to participate fully in sort of political society, right? Which is why Elizabeth Cady Stanton and all of them had to be like, hello, you have to stop thinking that way. And I was also in that way thinking about, again, to just go back to this thing, cities also enabled things like women's rights movements to coalesce because people are together in new ways, right? And can formulate these. So progress again becomes sort of valuable in one way and you can reject it in another way if everything is like fine for you and you've got all the things that you need. I was also thinking about, Christopher, when you were talking, and this might be useful for your continuing investigation of Hawthorne. If you read the Custom House, which is the beginning section of the Scarlet Letter, I don't know if you're familiar with that, but there's this part where he's like, I was an artist, but I had to get a job. And it's terrible to have a job, and it's so depressing. And then he has this kind of fantastic moment up in the attic of the Custom House where he finds a Scarlet A and then drops it in horror. Like it's the way that he talks, and anybody here who's read it more recently than I have can correct me if I'm mischaracterizing it, but isn't it just like, I'm depressed because I want to be an artist, but like I have to have a job like a regular slob, and it makes me really sad, and all the people I work with are like depressing. But then he goes up into the attic and has this kind of magical hallucinatory moment, and that allows him to think like an artist again, but it has to be separate from work. It has to be right. He has to have a moment where he feels like it's possible to not just be caught up in production, like, right. But it still emphasizes the alienated artist who can't be an artist because they have to like get a paycheck, right? And so yeah, Christopher, you're on mute, but
that also makes me think of Bartleby the Scrivener. I mean, because Melville had that meltdown, like, I have to make money to live, and all the ways I can make money really suck compared to creating this art. Like, I have to create something that sells instead of what I want to create.
Right. And all of that, I think, for what you're working out about this alienated artist is really useful, right? Oh, Melville, he was so sad. I had all these kids. I don't want a job. Yeah. So, that's really great. This is so interesting. Go ahead.
I had a question for Janavi, but if you have a question, I can let you go first. I've been not talking a lot. So my question for you was, I'm really interested in the way that both women and African American communities were kind of reclaiming the Declaration in order to advocate for their rights. And I think with that first sentence of the Declaration, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. You can see some of the ways that both the feminist movement and African Americans were playing with that first sentence. So like with women, it's like, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men and women were created equal. And then I think with African American communities, it's more like we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, and really heightening the emphasis on the all. But I'm curious if you saw any other significant differences in the ways that African Americans and women use the Declaration in their movements.
Yeah, suddenly the unmute button wasn't working. But I don't know if I've seen, if I can like right now come up with differences that probably the two groups differently used the Declaration or appropriated the Declaration of Independence. But I think the basis for the hope also in the Declaration of Independence, to which they kept coming back, to which they kept alluding and evoking in their speeches and writings, was was to essentially be considered a citizen of America. And if you be considered a citizen of America, that comes with certain guarantees and protections. And so, therefore, like Stanton does, is exploit or extend the not only the rational or the democratic idea of citizenship for women, but also its religious idea that all humans, are born equal, or all men are born equal, and they're born and they have certain natural rights. So the duality of this democracy that's new and the religious faith that's coming with them, with the tradition, the same way that Americans utilized it in the Declaration of Independence to sever ties with Britain, the same, they're trying to insert themselves in the same frame, in the same argument, because what is guaranteed to the citizens of US is exactly what they want. And in their speeches and in their writings, they've shown that, the rights that you've given, that the independence you talk about and the democracy that you're talking about, we want exactly the same things that's already laid out. It's just that the scope to the promises it's given to, the scope it applies to, needs to be expanded. We need to be inserted here too, and therefore they're arguing for their the fact that they have human souls. They are humans. They have human souls, and they are U.S. citizens. And by virtue of both the Constitution and religion, they deserve what's already written. So they're trying to portray their changes and demands as minor, but also as natural, as God-given, and as Constitution given. So the expansion happens this way. So I think I pointed out a similarity instead of differences, but maybe if I go back and look at all the texts that I've referred to again, I can probably come up with how the two groups have differently also evoked the Declaration of Independence. Thank you so much for the question.
These papers were wonderful, and I love this discussion. And sometimes a small group kind of facilitates really engaging a kind of back and forth. And so thank you all for your papers. We have just a couple of minutes left, and this is just a curiosity question, because I think we're all in different places. Emma and I might still be in the same place. So I'm in Las Vegas right now. Sorry, it looks like I'm sort of like hiding in a dark hallway. It's just the way the lighting is. There's also, because Las Vegas is so bizarre, there's also like a gigantic hip hop festival happening across the street from the hotel where the conference is. And just so you know, every time I leave my hotel room, the smell of marijuana is incredible. So it is here, it's 8:30, there's hip hop out on the street. Everything smells like weed. I'm curious where everybody else is and what time it is where you are.
I'm actually back in Knoxville, Tennessee now. So I missed a lot of the panels today. I saw Colin Cloud though, but I missed a lot of the panels because I was traveling. And so I'm in Knoxville. It's 11:27, and I've been a little bit distracted because my dog's on my lap. So I haven't been able to see her for 11 days. So I wanted to.
Oh, come on. Hooray. Thank you for sharing your dog. And I'm sorry it's so late, but you're a trooper to be here. So where is everybody else and what time is it?
So I'm in College Station, Texas, and it's 10:30 here. So it's okay. Yeah.
Okay. And then Christopher, I think you're in Reno, is that right?
Yeah, I would like to joke that I'm like right down the road, but I guess Reno's like 8 hours away. But yeah, no, I'm in Reno. I'm right across the street from the college. I can hear all of the drunk casino goers fighting outside. So I'm glad that my mic doesn't pick that up. People fight outside my window all the time. It's ridiculous. So yeah, no, it's beautiful here.
Thank you.
I've joined from India, Jammu and Kashmir to be more specific. Yeah, it's 10 in the morning,
Okay.
and usually this is the time I wake up. So
Okay. So you got up a little earlier.
yeah, a little.
Okay.
And actually, I've ended up missing a lot of panels, even though they were like there were 2 days of virtual panels because they happen in the night.
Right.
Yeah, night,
it's
early
hard.
morning. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Well, I'm just
it's
that this worked out that you could all participate in this way. This is, COVID was terrible, but it actually has facilitated a lot of this being able to interact with people at a great distance in ways that are starting to feel more natural. And so this is a wonderful panel. I loved all of your papers. You're doing wonderful things. And thank you so much for being here at all of these times of the day and night. And Emma, thank you for showing us your dog. I feel like that's a real triumph. And if any of you ever have any questions for me or questions for each other, I'll probably email everybody just a kind of another thank you. And then you can kind of see each other's contact information if these conversations want to continue kind of outside of this room. And thank you all again so much. And I hope for those of you for whom it is nighttime, it either gets quiet or you get some sleep. And then Janavi, I hope you have a beautiful day. And thank you all so much.
Thank you so much.
thanks so much.
All right, take care. I think, yeah. All right, good night, everybody.
Good night.
And good morning.